are the changes which are happening in America itself. America is changing. Now something happens. So the context of the American Revolution is the triggers. So now till this point we've understood the Americas. What was it? The problem of labor, slavery, Navigation Act, the existing system, the system of exploitation, and the last but not the least important concept of how they were maneuvering themselves and how America was changing at this point of time. So there will be a major trigger in the form of the 7 Years' War. 7 Years' War is seen as a major watershed moment in America because before that and after that, the whole course of history will change. Therefore, the 7 Years' War is always seen as a major trigger. Why? Because this was the fire which will burn the whole Americas. And this in turn will lead to increased control and revenue extraction. So these acts will become the major part of our larger story, the backbone of what happened in the American Revolution. So let's talk about the 7 Years' War first. So 7 Years' War, 1756-63. Very, very important. Why? Because it will change the British attitude. And we'll talk about what was happening before and after it. Let's understand the 7 Years' War. So 7 Years' War is linked to the Austrian War of Succession, which was happening beforehand in Europe itself in the 1740s itself. It was linked to the person who will come to power in Austria. And Britain and the French found themselves on the opposite sides, the French supporting Maria Theresa itself. The point is, don't have to go into the details of that, but the point is, Britain and France were on the opposite sides of this whole spectrum, which means that their conflicts initially did spill over into India in the form of the Carnatic Wars, but in Americas nothing happened. But when this war resumed in the form of the 7 Years' War in 1756, it became a major trigger for the American Revolution itself. So, countries involved in the conflict: England, Prussia, Austria, France, Spain, specifically France and England on the opposite sides. And the result was that the French and the Indian wars in Americas happened because of the spilling over of it. And there was a lot of exchange of territory between the French and the England thereafter. Let's try to understand the concept first. The concept is very simple, that the Americas was part of the larger colonial spectrum. In India, the Austrian War of Succession and the 7 Years' War actually impacted what is called the First Carnatic and the Third Carnatic War. In the same way, the first Austrian War of Succession, though did not have a direct consequence because Americas was still developing, the resumption of that war. So the initial one was about who will come to power in Austria, but then when the successor dies itself, the question comes in again in 56, which again resumes this war. The point was, in both America and India were involved, but America was not involved initially in the first sector or in the Austrian War of Succession. Second war, it became very, very entrenched. This is what is called the global nature of war at this point of time, that a conflict which started in Europe over Austria, or what is called the Habsburgian Empire or the Holy Roman Empire, itself led to the larger development of what is called the French and the Indian wars in America. So right now the war is spilling over into the Indian sector and the American sector. And what happens is that the British have to now defend the American colonies. And if the British have to defend the American colonies, they have to send a lot of contingents, they have to put in a lot of money. So the investment in protecting these colonies has now increased exponentially. And what happens in this war is that though the English come on top and there's a lot of exchange of territories in the form of Quebec, in the form of Canada, the French were given back two important islands in the Caribbean islands. But itself, the war was important because the English were now going to expect more from the Americas because they had invested quite a lot. So the French and the Indian wars, as they are called in America, though it's called the 7 Years' War in Europe, created the context in which the whole approach will change fully. So, what was the impact of the war? The impact of the war was very simple, that the British public expenditure and taxes and national debt rose enormously. And once the Peace of Paris was signed in 1763, when this war was over, the English had invested quite a lot into America. And more than that, that had created a national debt, a major debt in Britain itself. And though France ceded Canada to Britain and received back the sugar islands of Guadeloupe and Martinique, the Spanish ceded Florida to Britain in exchange for return of Philippines and Cuba, which was seized by the British during the war. The point is that the British came out on top, but their economic situation was weak. So they now have invested quite a lot of energy and money into America. So before we go into the slides itself, you try to understand something. Before, why is that the 7 Years' War is considered very, very important? It is considered important because before the 7 Years' War, there is no real urgency to draw too much revenue out of America. For the English, because they've invested zero, they do not want to exploit them via direct taxation or want to have a larger share of controlling the trade itself, because a lot of the trade which was happening through the navigation acts was circumvented through smuggling also. So what they used to do was they used to smuggle to the Caribbeans, and then from the Caribbeans they used to go to the rest of the world. So they used to rather send it to the French Caribbean, and the French used to take it to France, thereby totally negating the navigation act. So there was a lot of smuggling also which was happening. But before the 7 Years' War, because the investment is zero, the revenue, if it is low, nobody cared. The English were happy to fully take whatever they were getting. However, after the 7 Years' War, national debt has risen. The economic weakness of the British has come in. The problem is that the national debt is because of defending the Americas. Investment has gone into the form of military and money. So now the British expect more. And on the other hand, for the Americans, it was also important because their identity got crystallized in the sense that the Americans, in order to fight the French and fighting with the other different colonies, these 13 colonies came together and created the context in which the concept of America became very, very important and American became very, very important. So at one hand, there is a crystallization of American identity. They are slowly but surely now identifying themselves as American and less as British Americans. That word British is now being dropped. At the same time, the British attitude will change because they want to get more out of the Americas. And it is here that the 7 Year War creates the push, the impetus for the change in America itself and the American Revolution itself. So the impact of the war is that this 7 Years' War, even before it was over, the British changed their attitude. Please, I will write it down. You need to understand this. Before the 7 Years' War and after the 7 years, something changes. Before the 7 Years' War, the British are happy to take what they want to take, and the Americans realize and generally identify themselves as British Americans. After the 7 Years' War, what happens is that the British attitude will change, which will trigger the American Revolution, and the Americans are now believing themselves as American, not British American. So even before the 7 Years' War was over, there was something called the writ of assistance, which was given to the different commissioners there, the customs commissioners, so as to seize ships which were doing smuggling. So they could check the merchant ships. Merchants were impacted quite a lot. There was a lot of checking. If they had contraband, if they had or were trading or were defying the Navigation Act itself, they could seize the ship. So even before the 7 Years' War was over, they started to change the revenue extraction model. This is important to understand why, because once this revenue extraction model will change, the American attitude will also change. So the writ of assistance warrant merchant ships can be checked. But as soon as the war was over, the first thing which they did in order to pay the army and the debt, it was about debt. It was about debt and how they could pay for that debt. Lord North and specifically James I, who came to power, wanted more. And they wanted more out of the Americas. So, first thing, first act. Now remember, the American Revolution is nothing but a series of acts and how the Americans responded to it. So, we will keep on tracing these acts. The first is the Molasses Act of 1733. What did it do? Molasses is nothing but good, what is before sugar. The concept was that in order to create sugar, you need molasses. So you had different sources, the French Caribbean Islands, the Spanish Caribbean Islands, the British Caribbean Islands. So in order to keep everything within the British and benefiting the British Caribbean Islands, they said that we will put a 6 pence duty on a gallon bought from the French or Spanish West Indies, but there will be no duty on the English molasses, thereby giving a preferential outlook to the British West Indies. This was to technically increase direct control over the trade and increase the indirect taxes out of the West Indies. This is a very important point because you are seeing the change in attitude itself. They are now trying to extract more. The money which had been invested into Americas, the English wanted it back. And this is how the American Revolution will technically start. So, the next and the most important trigger, first trigger is the 7 Years' War. The first bomb, if you want to discuss, is the Stamp Act of 1765. So, we have the 7 Years' War, and the main moment in which everything will change, that will politically unite the Americas, that will change everything, will be the Stamp Act. What did Stamp Act do? See, Stamp Act said that any official piece of paper needed to have stamp duties. That stamp was only available by the British official. Therefore, duties on newspaper, books, court documents, commercial papers, land deeds, and almanacs, everything produced on an official scale needed to have stamp duties or stamps on them for which you pay duties, like our stamp paper. So, why is that this changed everything? You would have realized one thing, that before this point, all form of taxation is indirect. And I've been emphasizing this point quite a lot. However, this was a direct tax paid by everyone. Everyone. Till this point, whilst they wanted to get what they wanted to get from the merchants, it was only the merchant community which was getting affected by the British legislation. This law, the Stamp Act, now impacted everyone. And now the new rhetoric based on the American Enlightenment, based on these new ideas which were coming in, will ask one thing: how can you tax us when you do not represent us? No taxation without representation, because America, this American concept of liberty, freedom, said America is not represented in the British Parliament. Indirect taxation is okay. You give us economic opportunity, but you don't tax us if there is no represented in the House of Commons or the House of Lords. Then why is that you are directly taxing? This direct taxation is the trigger for everything. If the direct taxes would not have been taken, maybe the American Revolution would not have ever happened. Lord North and James I, what they did was that they triggered this whole revolution because of the fact that they created the context in which the direct tax regime now impacted everybody. And once it impacts everybody, now they will not hold back. It created political unity. It created the first revolutionary organization called the Sons of Liberty. And it is one of the most important acts in this regard. So the significance of this act was, for the first time, the parliament attempted to raise money from direct taxes in the colonies rather than through the regulation of trade. The idea of no taxation without representation became very, very important because they believed that no representation of America in parliament, and this Enlightenment ideas had created the concept of representation, civil liberties, liberty, freedom, and the war. What it had done is that it had created this American identity. that we all are American and not British Americans. And the Stamp Act impacted every strata of the society. So there was a popular discontent. The direct impact would be that they will start to boycott, and even there will be the birth of the Sons of Liberty, which was the first revolutionary organization in America. They will also get united politically because it impacted everybody. While the British will later repeal this act and go to Townshend duties, go back to regulation of trade, the damage was already done. The British attitudes were now not acceptable in America. They wanted more money out of America and they were not ready to give. So it was the economic response to economic exploitation. That is why we call the American Revolution as the economic nationalism movement. It's a moment of economic nationalism because their nationalism came in because of mercantilist exploitation, exploitation through trade, specifically when direct taxation comes in. So the taxes which were being imposed till this point and thereafter, which were there, will now become this series in which we need to understand the larger American Revolution. So we have 1763, the Proclamation 1763, halt of colonial settlements west of Appalachian Mountains, prevent warfare with the Indians. Sugar Act was already there, 1764, to collect revenue by reducing the tax on molasses and discouraging smuggling. Then comes the main trigger. This is the main act which changed everything. They also have the Declarationary Act, which happens next year, to declare that the British Parliament had two powers to make the laws of the colonies. But this was again a very bad decision at a very bad point of time. We will then talk about the Townshend duties, what they did, then the Tea Act, the Intolerable Act, and the Quebec Act. And the Intolerable Act will create the context in which by 1774, the American Revolution will create what is called the Continental Congress. The first Continental Congress, the second Continental Congress. So we need to now do this journey. In between, we have to do the Boston Tea Party. We need to understand what is the Boston Massacre. So here I'm just giving you a very simple prelude to what is going to happen. Now there is this journey we need to take. I hope you are now very, very wary of what we mean by the American Revolution. American Revolution is nothing but the creation of the Continental Congresses. It was created because of the 7 Years' War. The 7 Years' War changed the British attitude. They became desperate to get more money. That created the context in which they were extracting more out of America. That also led to them introducing the Stamp Act, which became the starting point of the whole revolution. So what is the road to the revolution? I've shown you the road. Let's discuss it in a lot of detail. So, once the Sons of Liberty started to protest against the Stamp Act got repealed. But what it did was that it politically united the Americas, and it also showed that the duties of the British towards America are not being fulfilled. More than that, direct taxation means taxation without representation is not possible. So they will repeal it. And this Sons of Liberty, the general revolutionary spirit behind it was very, very important. This will not let this issue go away. They will go back to what are called the Townshend duties, 1767, indirect taxation on imported goods with a new board of custom commissioners. They were to check smuggling. So they went back to indirect taxation, but it was too late. And there will be now escalation, de-escalation, escalation, de-escalation, and there will be a moment of escalation which will never de-escalate. And that moment is called the Boston Massacre. So in order to aid these custom commissioners, again, listen to me, what happens is that these custom commissioners were placed in all the important ports. In Boston, what happens is that they're also sent with a lot of contingent of army. So an army contingent was placed in Boston to check smuggling. So some young men, what they do is the tensions are already there. The political unity has already been created. The identity has already been created. This tension will lead to what is called a small moment, though called a massacre, is that there will be some young men who will start to tease the British army or the British contingent, which was there, start to throw snowballs. It was the winter at this point of time. So what happens is they throw the snowballs on these different officers, and the British contingent shoots all the men who are involved in this skirmish. 5 people die, and now this becomes the rallying point and the next escalation of the story. So skirmish between the soldiers and locals, 5 persons were killed. British then had to withdraw the soldiers because the Sons of Liberty were now rallying behind everybody. They were now trying to find a way to create more and more entry points into removing the British out of America. Now, rumors and different escalation moments were also there in England, such as the John Wilkes story, where Wilkes was very, very pro American and he was expelled out of the House of Commons because he was writing pro American articles. And the Americans now started to rally behind this also. Religious intervention into colonies was also now being pushed as rumors that the British will introduce Catholicism, the Protestant ethic will be taken away. The point is that the British had already done the blunder. They had already done the blunder of what? Of introducing direct taxation. That became a trigger. Now the merchants used it to push their agenda also, and they became the major leaders of the whole Sons of Liberty, specifically Samuel Adams. The point of the matter is that this escalation, they did not want to give away. But the major moment in this story will come because of the Indian connection, which is the Tea Act and the tea crisis. So again, listen to me very, very clearly. What is the concept of the tea crisis and the Boston Tea Party? The trigger for this does not start here. It starts in India. In India, the British get the Diwani rights. Once they get the Diwani rights, Clive starts to tell to the court of directors that we are expecting a lot of revenue out of Bengal, Bihar, and Odisha. This creates what is called the financial bubble of the East India Company. So what happens is Clive is saying there will be 3 crore dam which will come from, or rupiah which will come from Bengal, Bihar, and Odisha, which meant that the company shareholders would get a major dividend. So this means that everybody wanted to invest in the East India Company, knowing this Clivian notion of getting a lot of money. He was escalating the money which was going to be coming from Bengal, Bihar, and Odisha. And what happens is that the stock price of the East India Company, which was just £5, now becomes £500 because everybody wants it. There is more demand for the share than the supply. So the East India Company stock rises artificially, which is called the financial bubble, that it is artificially rising, though there is no backing of the fact that that much level amount of revenue will come in. Clive was just creating this exaggerated picture of it. And the East India Company will start to get a lot of demand for a share. Everybody was waiting for the revenue to be collected in the season in India. And then the major blunder happens is that once they use the initial system of Diwani, in which they were not allowing the Bengali officials to collect their revenue in the right way, half of what Clive said was collected from Bengal. And this meant that the dividend which everybody was expecting was very small. And there's a major drop. Everybody sells their East India Company stock. So there's more supply for East India Company stock. This is called the bursting of the financial bubble of the East India Company. The East India Company now is in a financial crisis. Why? Because its stock, which was now at £500, has reached £1 because nobody wants it. Clive had created a false picture, a bubble which burst like 2008, the whole housing bubble in USA, which led to a recession. Same way, the East India Company created the context of a financial bubble, Clivian notions. The court of directors very excited. Whole excitement, big bubble bursts. No real dividend comes in. Everybody sells their East India Company stock. East India Company is now in a crisis. This creates the context in which the tea crisis will happen in America, because now the British Parliament, who are most of the people who are holding the shares of the East India Company, most of the MPs of the House of Commons, they need to find a solution to revive the East India Company as a financial entity. So what they do is that they give the East India Company the right to sell tea, which they had acquired in India and in China, at a duty-free price in America, meaning they would not have to pay any import duty, export duty, or anything. This made the competition redundant, meaning Be it an American, be it a French, be it a Spanish tea seller, they would never be able to compete because all of them would have to pay a duty, but the East India Company would not have to. And this became the moment in which now when East India Company ships started to come in into the Boston harbor, into the different harbors, they were protesting against not letting them dock. And most of the anger was that you have created an artificial competition and the East India Company had a comparative advantage. So in most of the docks, what happened is that the East India Company ship was not allowed to dock in, but the governor of Boston, specifically Hutchinson, he insisted that we should. So the Boston harbor had one important ship with at least 20,000 pounds worth of tea on it. And the Sons of Liberty, defying their will of not allowing the ship to enter into the Boston harbor, what they do is that they, in disguise, enter the ship in the night and throw all the tea as a form of resistance and protest into the Boston harbor, which is called the Boston Tea Party, because the whole harbor became brown the way tea gives you the color. So that is called the Boston Tea Party. And this will become a major escalation point between the British and the Americans. And this will not de-escalate itself, because the next act which will come in will be called the Intolerable Acts, which will create the context in which a lot of problems will be created. The tea was consumed as by all sections of the society. East India Company was allowed to ship and sell tea in colonies at unrealistic prices exempted from import duties. Smuggling and American merchants could not compete with this price generally. So what happens is that the ship were mostly not allowed to unload in most of the harbors. However, Hutchinson insisted that Boston should allow it, and the Sons of Liberty, under the leadership of Samuel Adams, threw the tea into the harbor, having the biggest tea party in the world. But this changed everything. Now Lord North and James I will say, enough is enough. We are the mighty British power. We are a power in India. We will not accept this form of childish resistance from America. And the next set of acts are called the Intolerable Acts by the Americans. On the other hand, they are also called the Coercive Acts. And these coercive acts was about punishing the Bostonians, was about now making sure that the Americans get to know who they were dealing with. The Americans were dealing with the British and not a joke. So the revolution and the Continental Congress, the revolution has just reached its last moment, after which it will begin properly. As soon as the Continental Congresses will be formed, we believe that the American Revolution has begun. So the Intolerable Acts, what they argued was that first, the Bostonian harbor will be closed. Once it will be closed, nobody would be allowed to come into the harbor. Nobody will be allowed to export or import until and unless 10,000 pounds worth of tea which was thrown into the harbor was paid for by the Bostonians. So this was the first thing. Second thing which it said, so they first wanted to punish the Bostonians. Second thing which is that they said that now their whole structure which was generally there was that they used to have a governor and a council. The council was elected by the people of that colony, but the governors were nominated by the British. So the executive was always nominated, the legislature was elected. But the second Intolerable Act said that the governor will now accept his own council and nominate it. So the democratic element of electing their own officials was taken away. Thereby, an administrative change, economic change, Boston needs to pay. And the third and the most important was what are called the residency clause, in which they said that we are sending a new contingent of army men or the military to America, and every American has to host and lodge the British army. Meaning that if the army is going through your town, you have to give them food, shelter, and everything. Which meant that the first and the second. First point is making the Bostonians pay. Second, to change the whole administrative structure. And third, the residency clause was very, very important, because now lodging and hosting meant that everybody would be impacted. And there was also what is called the Quebec Act, which we already discussed, which was about Canada full control was now fully taken by the British. But there were rumors that the Catholic Church was being given certain rights in Canada, which meant that now for the first time, the religious freedom of the Americans was also under a lot of major threat. So what happens is that this intolerable acts and the Quebec Act created the context in which all Americans came together in what we call as the First Continental Congress. The American Revolution has begun. British legitimacy over colonies was diminished. Virginia House of Burgesses passed a resolution for the constitution of a Congress. 56 members will meet at the Philadelphia Conference, which is called the Philadelphia Continental Congress, on 5th September 1774. And now the American War of Independence has started. The point is, they said enough is enough. We cannot tolerate this kind of behavior from the British, and the political unity will come in. The association called the Continental Association, it will be given the task of doing two things. First, they said that we will boycott all British goods. We will boycott the British itself. That needed to be enforced, that the Continental Association will do. They will also check the merchants are not smuggling to the Britishers. At the same time, they also said that now we need to decide what will be the fate of America. Their understanding was that there was a moderate faction which said that should we still have a symbolic relationship with the British? And an aggressive, radical faction, the Son of Liberty, said no, we want complete independence. And they were now internally debating that in the larger context. So the First Continental Congress had two different understandings. Sons of Liberty, resistance through force, and they wanted to just fully cleanse the American society of all privileges. Moderates who wanted to compromise, wealthy class did not want a social revolution. They resolved at a place called Suffolk. In Suffolk, they said that we refuse to accept the coercive acts, but we will think about what will be the further course of action. Do we want to still have a relationship with the British, or do we fully remove that? The point is, now the British had become fully intolerable. They were not ready to de-escalate. They were not ready to accept any shenanigans. They were not ready to accept anything from the Americans. They wanted full subservience because they already had India. Their position changed. So you can see how a small change in the attitude because of the 7 Years' War, thereafter the Stamp Act, thereafter the Tea Act, thereafter the Intolerable Acts has now brought this relationship to this point that economic nationalism is now rising in the context of how American Revolution has been seen. So the Continental Association, which was created by the First Continental Congress itself, will argue the following. Commercial boycott of the British. We will not trade with the British itself. The French held a major stronghold with the Americans. They were a major support point, and I will show you, we will see in the next section, which is on French Revolution, how this helped to the Americans will bankrupt the French, which will then trigger their revolution, the French Revolution. Stopping trade with Great Britain. They wanted to create what are called the Committees of Safety and Inspection. They were going to check that this commercial boycott was fully in force. Obey and prevent the merchants from trading. And now they put or pushed what is called the Declaration of Rights and Grievances to the British. The British rejected it. They said that we don't care. We want full subjugation. We will now directly tax you also. We are not ready to accept anything. So now the perception will slowly change because they could see that the British were not ready to accept anything. So the first perception was from limiting the parliament's power over the governing of colonies. They said that if the power of the parliament is there over the colonies, how much it should be there. The other one was this question that does the British parliament even have authority over the colonies? So whether the British or the parliament should have any authority over the colonies. So you have this faction under Benjamin Franklin, which believes that we still need to have a symbolic relationship with the crown. Under other important radicals such as Samuel Adams, they said no, enough is enough. We want full independence. And that perception, the second perception, will prevail once there will be an armed conflict which will begin and the British will start to fight with the Americans at the what is called the Lexington skirmish. Now the fate has been decided that it will be an armed conflict. The War of Independence has now begun, and this War of Independence will in turn lead to the American Revolution completing its full circle and America getting independence. We don't have to go into the War of Independence, but we need to understand what is the American Revolution itself. As soon as the British will start to fight, the Second Continental Congress, the first met in 1774. In 1776, they will call the Second Continental Congress in Philadelphia again. Now, by this point of time, two very important personalities have joined the Congress itself, which is Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson is going to write the Declaration of Independence itself. What they did was that they created a New England militia. That New England militia is nothing but the army of the Americans, and that commander-in-chief of this was George Washington, who's going to later be the first president. He was made the commander-in-chief, and the task of getting America independence. Governors who were nominated were replaced by local bodies, and now the loyalist and the patriot factions were now fully contemplating on the issue: should we get complete independence or not? The point was, there was no other option at this point of time, because the British was not ready to back down, and they're not ready to back down, they have no other option. So finally, what happens is, in autumn of 1775, the 5 colonies were still against independence. But by May of 1776, Continental Congress advised all the different colonies that you should be ready for independent governance, because we will be going for the war and we will get independence. In July of 1776, Thomas Jefferson will be appointed as the drafting member of the Declaration of Independence itself, and he will write the Declaration of Independence. And on July 2nd and 4th, July 4th is the Independence Day, the declaration will be adopted by all the colonies, and the American Revolution produced the most important moment, the Declaration of Independence. And our story technically ends there. But what is the significance of this moment? And I'll give you a summary before we move on to the questions. It was a struggle to somehow find economic exploitation as unjust. So it was dependency to independent states, monarchy to republic, membership in an extended empire in which several members were connected through the center itself, to participation as a federal nation. The point is, the significance of this whole moment is, it was the first democratic revolution based on the ideals of economic nationalism. This is a very important point you need to understand. That it was the first democratic revolution. It added 2-3 very important ideals such as democracy, freedom, and liberty into the vocabulary of the world. So, what is the whole point? Let's try to understand. See, before the 7 Years' War, the attitude of the Americans is what? We are British citizens, but living in America. They were happy to be indirectly taxed, because merchants were the only one who were being taxed. The British was happy what they wanted. The British, through the Navigation Acts, created a regime of import-export duty. Everybody was happy. Nobody wanted anything more. Investment was less, so revenue less was acceptable. But then the 7 Years' War happens. The investment of the British increases, so their attitude changes. They wanted more out of the American colonies. So then they introduced first the Molasses Act, try to get more. The writs of assistance have already been introduced to check smuggling. But the major movement will come in the form of the Stamp Act, which will change everything, because it will be the first direct taxation. This direct taxation, only attempt to do that, will politically unite everybody, create radical organizations, and then create the context in which now economic nationalism was reaching at its highest point. The wars had united the Americans itself. Thereafter, the Stamp Act will be repealed, but the damage was already done. They will go back to townshend duties, which are nothing but indirect taxation. But the Boston Massacre showed that the tensions were still very, very high. Then the East India Company will have a major crisis because of the financial bubble created by Clive, in turn leading to the Tea Act, which will lead to the Boston Tea Party. Thereafter, the British attitude totally changed. They said enough is enough. Intolerable acts make them pay and punish. And the Quebec Act, because religious freedom was now at stake, will lead to the larger context of the First Continental Congress, Continental Association, Second Continental Congress, and the Continental Army under Washington, which will fight for the next 6 years to get independence. But that story is not important for us. GS examination for UPSC itself. The point is, increasing control over the colonies was the starting point. Strategies of revenue extraction when they changed from indirect to direct taxation is what is the American Revolution. Notion of freedom and liberty was now introduced into the whole society of America, and now the American Revolution introduced these ideals into the world itself. It became the first democratic revolution, the oldest democracy. Continental Congress and Declaration of Independence now became staple documents which will be used later. And I will show you how the American War of Independence is going to be extremely important in the French Revolution, because the French, who gave them the Statue of Liberty in the form of a symbol of getting independence, will become bankrupt, and that will in turn create the context in which we will have the National Assembly being formed in the French Revolution. That is for a separate story altogether. So, I hope now the American Revolution is clear. There can be only 2-3 types of questions which can come in. First, what was the cause? Causes are the acts and the 7-year war. So 7 years war is the first reason. Second reason is the act itself. In these acts, you need to emphasize on Stamp Act, and you need to emphasize on what is called the Tea Act and on the Intolerable Acts. And the second type of question can come on significance. So you need to be very, very wary of how you approach that in that regard. So let's look at a question which came in 2013. American Revolution was an economic revolt against mercantilism. Substantiate. So it's about the nature or significance of the revolution. Here, what we see is very simply in the introduction, body, conclusion. In the introduction, you are going to write the importance of the American Revolution generally. You will say that the American Revolution, which was based on a series of acts and changing attitude of the British and the Americans, was a very significant moment in world history. Then you will tell them what were the flashpoints. And you will say the flashpoints was mostly about the Americans resisting economic exploitation. So in the second part, you will then argue that if you look at the revolution itself, it was an economic revolt against mercantilism. Mercantilism is an ideology which we'll discuss later also again. It's an ideology of trade-based extraction. So once the Stamp Act and the Tea Act made very, very obvious that it was mercantilist forces which were working in the background, the American Revolution is nothing but an economic revolt or an American economic nationalistic movement. And conclude by saying that yes, the American Revolution was an economic revolt, because if you look at the causes, you only have to put the causes here. The causes were based on acts, and the acts were nothing but economic. So you create a link in this regard and create a very good answer. Very easy question to answer itself. Now, this is the only question which have come in. The other type of question which has come in, we'll discuss with French Revolution, because the question was that how and why are both these events important and why are they significant. So we'll cover that question when we'll discuss it in a French Revolution, which is the next unit itself. Some important questions for your practice. Discuss the causes and consequences of the American Revolution. A very basic question. You should practice and send it to us at islive@byju's.com. We would actually want you to do that. And again, the structure will be very, very simple. Causes, consequences. Don't have to emphasize anything else. Just create a very good introduction in which you talk about America getting colonized and becoming economically viable through the Navigation Acts. Then body, in which you talk about the causes from the 7 Years War, changing attitude, Stamp Act, Tea Act, Intolerable Act, and consequences in the conclusion, when it became the first democratic revolution of the world. Liberty and freedom were now in the vocabulary of the world itself. With this, I would like to end this session. I hope that all this made sense to you. It's a very important unit because it is the starting point of world history itself. I hope that now you have an understanding. Remember, it's only the acts and the significance which will always come. Causes and consequences. Causes were the acts which we have already discussed in quite a lot of details. The Stamp Act, duties put on the stamp and on legal paper. The Tea Act, revive East India Company. Intolerable Act, first act was nothing but that the Bostonians have to pay for the 10,000 pounds worth of tea. Boston Harbor has been closed. Second, the whole administrative structure was changed from executives now dominating and nominating the legislative also. the popular democratic institutions were removed, and third was how what is called the residency clauses, that the military needs to lodge with the people. That created the context in which First Continental Congress, Second Continental Congress, and the American Revolution is done. Thank you so much for your patience. I will see you in the next video with another topic related to world history.